My name is Nathan Alberg. I'm the Illinois Farmland Director with the Land Connection. Welcome to Creative Farmland Access through Self-Directed IRAs, our webinar. I'm joined by two of my colleagues, Jeannie Jansen and Erica Peters. Appreciate their helping on the webinar. Very happy to welcome you. We're really glad you're joined. We're hoping that this webinar will be useful to you and that it's also useful to the larger farmland access movement. We have an audience from around the country. We have I think we have 17 states represented. We have farmland investors, we have farmers looking for land, we have service providers, and we also have retirement investors. So we're really happy that we've attracted such a big audience. Before I say a word about the genesis of this program and the context, I wanted to say a little bit about the Land Connection and Illinois FarmLink. The Land Connection is a food and farming focused nonprofit that's based in Champaign, Illinois. And we believe that the kind of agriculture we have has a large part in determining how healthy families are, how strong rural communities are, whether our skies and lands and waters are full of life, and whether farmers can make a good living. And to do our part to sort of move towards that kind of a good agriculture we like to see, we do a variety of things. We do farmer education in a variety of ways, including an organic grain mentorship program. We run 2 farmers markets in the Champaign-Urbana area, and we also do some creative linking systems that enable people of all incomes to be able to afford good local food. And we also do eater education. We launched the Illinois FarmLink program in 2023 because we had seen how farmers couldn't find farmland donors and farmland donors couldn't find farmers. Next slide, Mary, by the way. We also found that even when there was a good match, sometimes they had a hard time working out a good arrangement. And so through free advising, help with matchmaking, and education resources like this webinar, we're doing our best to address those needs in Illinois. I want to say a brief thanks to the USDA Beginning Farmer and Rancher Development Program, as well as our other funders for making everything that we do possible. So it was in March of 2016 when I first learned of Wyatt and Mary's arrangement. And it's been over 8 years since. I was so curious, and I've been so full of so much admiration for both of them that I've been tracking them ever since. I wouldn't say trolling, but I've been kind of following their story. And earlier this year, I asked Mary and Wyatt to share their story at their organic grain conference that we host every year. And there was really a lot of positive feedback about it. People were really, really intrigued. And so it really made sense for us to share it with a larger audience. And so I'm really grateful to them both and to Paul for kind of pitching in to make this possible. I believe that this story matters on 2 levels. One is the human level. How many of us are actually willing to sort of to endure some risk and tackle some complexity because of our values? Mary's values, as you're going to hear, were based on her own personal health experience. And that drove her to look for alternative arrangements for her retirement investing. And most people, when they thought about their values in investing, they might just say, it's too complex. Why should I bother trying to take on that complexity? And as the world sometimes worked, the right person was in her universe when she needed that person. That was Wyatt. And he was ready to try something and work it out and take some risk as well. The other level of this story is the macro factor that farmers like Wyatt face across the country. And that's the incredibly high price for farmland. And it's not just the high prices, it's the fact that the high prices have been completely divorced from the realities of what revenue you can generate from a piece of land. And you and I have seen the problems that this is causing for farmers and agriculture. Could the self-directed IRA, despite its complexities, at least help some farmers work out arrangements that help them get around that chronic pricing problem? After all, the 401k only became ubiquitous in the early 1980s. And behind that question is a larger one. What can we actually do to make farmland affordable for farmers? I don't know the answers to all those questions, but we hope this webinar in some way contributes to the conversation. I am deeply grateful to Mary Gelder and Wyatt Muse for taking the time to put together this webinar and for sharing it. Also really grateful to Paul Dietmann of Compeer Financial, who really encouraged us to sort of do this webinar and share some really interesting analysis as well. So here are a few tips on today's webinar. First, use the chat for any questions. I will facilitate those questions and get those to our presenters. There will be several Q&A sessions at different points that you'll be able to sort of get responses from the speakers. Number two, please mute your audio so we can have really good audio quality and not get distracted. Three, we will be recording this for YouTube, and we'll share a link with that YouTube with you before long. And then finally, I will be sending you a link in the email eventually to a PDF of this PowerPoint. So you'll have the PowerPoint available to you. And finally, we want to be clear, this webinar shouldn't be taken as financial or legal advice. If you're thinking about a self-directed IRA, please get professional advice from an attorney or a financial expert. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to you, Mary. Thank you so much.
Okay, Wyatt, take it away.
Hey, thanks. Can everyone hear me okay? A nod?
Yes.
All right, fantastic. My name is Wyatt Muse, and I'm going to introduce you to a little overview of what we're going to talk about today. I'm going to give my personal story. Mary's going to talk about her story. We're going to introduce the self-directed IRA as a solution and how it specifically worked for us. There are pros and cons for the farmer, pros and cons for the investor, some lessons that we've learned, and then finally, Paul is going to talk about some insights and how that might work and integrate with financing. So again, Wyatt Muse. I was raised just west of Champaign, Illinois, in Monticello, the fourth generation to farm in that community. And growing up, I was very interested in farming. But the 1980s and early 1990s were not exactly fantastic for the farm economy. So I went to school at University of Illinois. My dad always said that we can raise a good crop, but learning how to market it was the big challenge. So I decided to try to become an expert at something, and that was in grain marketing. So I spent about 15 years, my early career, buying grain and trading grain, really focused on food grade crops like white corn, certified organic grains. And in that process, really fell in love with organic production and the challenges and the opportunities and really fulfilling what consumers were looking for. Through that time, I continued to have a desire and a thirst for farming and running my own farm. There were some significant challenges to entering. And even though I'm the fourth generation to farm, in many senses, I'm a first generation farmer in that way. So I farm today, co-owner and operator at Dirt Road Organics. And Mary, I think you can advance the slide maybe to the next one. Okay, maybe that was a little quick. But in 2014, Mary and I were both serving on the board of the Land Connection. I was 32 years old at the time, 31, 32, and started a family, had bought a home and really wanted to invest in farmland, but the capital requirement and the down payment needed felt insurmountable while also working and living and having all the normal pressures of life. The slide that's up right now is really just a call to action for anyone is, rather than sitting and thinking about it and talking about it, putting things to action. I love planting trees. I plant trees every year. I've never regretted planting a tree, and I've not regretted entering into this agreement with Mary. And I think that's all for now, Mary.
Okay. My great-grandfather migrated from England to North Dakota and bought himself a farm at the age of 24. He was a very hardworking guy and was one of the early settlers in North Dakota. His sons also became farmers in the same area, and my own father grew up on one of those farms. Dad later left farming to become an accountant, so I grew up as a city girl. Still, I always loved Dad's stories about the farm and especially loved our occasional visits to the farm while Grandma and Grandpa Gelder were still alive. So I definitely have a soft spot for farming. I suspect that great-grandpa Christopher Gelder leveraged the Homestead Act of 1862 when he bought his first farm, but I don't know this for sure. The Homestead Act made it possible for prospective farmers to obtain land in exchange for a small fee and an agreement to build a home on it and live there for a certain number of years, working the land. Things are very different now, and it's not so easy for farmers to obtain land. In fact, access to land is the #1 challenge facing the next generation of farmers in the United States. So it was 2014, 10 years ago, that Wyatt and I decided to partner. So what was I doing in 2014 that led to this? I had spent 10 years in the trading industry working for GetCo, which is Global Electronic Trading Company. I'm not a trader. I wrote the software that connected our proprietary trading system to various exchanges around the world. I really like making computers talk to each other, but I'm not so much interested in trading. I think it's one of the craziest ironies that I ended up spending so much time in the trading industry, considering my lack of interest in financial matters. We had an office in the Chicago Board of Trade building downtown. The CBOT came about to begin with because of the need Midwest farmers had to share the risks they faced, and the incentive to investors is to share not only in the risks, but also in the profits. Before 9/11, the Board of Trade building had a museum. I clearly remember one of the pictures there that depicted farmers tragically dumping their crops into the river because they were unable to sell them at the market, and they had to return to their homes empty-handed. Farmers back then had other things to worry about besides land access. Farmers faced risks back then before we had our system that included futures and other investments in agriculture. Such investments benefit farmers and investors alike. Wyatt and I wanted a partnership that would benefit both him and me. We wanted a win-win situation. I had left GetCo in 2012 because I wanted to finish my career doing something that would benefit the environment. I returned to school to pursue a master's degree in environmental health sciences. So in 2014, I was going to school full-time in my 50s. This was a personal journey, learning about health and nutrition, which led to learning about environmental issues, and specifically those issues stemming from industrial conventional food production. I became involved with the Land Connection and became a board member. And this, by the way, is how I met Wyatt. He was also on the board. But aside from all that involvement, plus voting with my fork, I didn't think at the time there was much else I could do as a non-farmer to support local organic farming. But what were some of the things that were going through my mind in those days? What was important to me? Well, these are some of the things I was concerned about: environmental justice, pesticides, climate change, consumerism, big ag, big banks, big pharma, loss of topsoil, superweeds, CAFOs, deforestation, the overuse of plastic, and plastic waste. Sorry, can someone please mute themselves? Thank you. And on and on. One day my banker had called me and said he wanted to develop a relationship with me. And this is a picture of my bank. So there I was, walking in the door for my appointment, thinking, this is silly. Why am I doing this? But the banker quickly got me talking, and I found myself telling him all about pesticides and GMOs and rainwater and the loss of topsoil and CAFOs and superweeds and seed monopolies and all those things in the previous slide. And those who know me know it's not hard to get me going on those subjects. You know, Mary, he said, and I admit I didn't see it coming from him, the M word, your 401ks are likely invested in Monsanto. I'm not sure, but I think my jaw must have been on the floor, and I instantly realized that he was right. Where we bank and where we invest our money can make a difference. And I'm here today to tell you we can do more for local farmers than vote with our fork. Anyway, I had a problem, and I was determined to find a solution. We had a couple of follow-up visits, both he and I independently researching ethical funds. He found something that he thought would work for me. It did not invest in things like big oil and big ag, but the investments didn't interest me that much. Still, I had to get my money out of Monsanto, so I was paying attention. And then he gave me the lowdown on his fees to manage the funds for me. And his quote was $6,000 to $7,000 per year. And now I had to do some serious soul searching. It's easy to say I don't want to invest in Monsanto, which is now Bayer, by the way, but that was a lot of money on the line. I was faced with this new reality and had to make a decision. How badly did I not want to invest in Monsanto? Well, it turned out it was very badly. So I signed over one of my 401ks to him, and still, it was enough of a shock that I held off on my other one for the time being. The very next day, we had a land connection board meeting, and we were discussing the challenge of land access for farmers. Out of the blue, Wyatt started talking about an idea he had about SDIRAs, and I just about fell out of my chair. Here I was going through this personal crisis about my 401ks, and he had this brilliant solution, and I knew instantly that it was for me. But now I was in trouble. I just signed over one of my 401ks to my banker. The next morning, I called my friend at the bank and learned that they had not yet started the rollover process, thank heavens. I was so lucky. Because of this had happened so quickly, I was fortunately able to back out of that investment and focus on the SDIRA idea that Wyatt had described. And by the way, speaking of relationships, John Eichert gave the keynote speech at one of the recent Land Connection Organic Grains conferences, and maybe some of you were there. He said that the essential building blocks of relationships include honesty, fairness, responsibility, compassion, and respect. He pointed out that these building blocks not only apply to personal relationships, but business relationships as well. I bring this up because one of the huge benefits of the SDIRA solution to land access is that the investor and farmer share a real relationship. We know each other. This is an investment where I can go out and actually visit the farm. I can talk to the farmer. Wyatt and I essentially used these 5 building blocks as we discussed and shaped our partnership and agreements. And what a huge difference this makes over investing in some fund somewhere where you don't even know at any one time exactly where your money is, or any of the people working for the companies you're invested in. Instead of signing a multi-page document containing fine print that you only vaguely understand, Wyatt and I wrote our partnership agreements pretty much ourselves with some guidance from the attorney. And we know very well what the terms are, and we developed them to benefit both of us. We wanted a win-win relationship. So Wyatt's going to talk about his goals in a minute, but what did I want from our partnership? I've already beat the first goal here to death. I wanted my savings to support a cause I believe in, not something that is counter to my values. The second goal was to protect my retirement savings from inflation. I had worked hard for my nest egg, and I didn't want to see it slip away from me. And notice that it was not one of my goals to leverage my savings to get as rich as I could with the highest returns possible. That said, I believed that land was a solid investment. My crystal ball was telling me that quality farmland was going to be in demand in the future.
Thank you, Mary. So next to Mary, I had some challenges as well. I was looking to own land. As I mentioned earlier, in my early 30s, being able to save enough to make that down payment felt like it was going to take a long time. So maybe I could have enough for the down payment by the time I was 40, and then you sign up for a 30-year mortgage that you get paid off by the time you're 70. And by the time you work your entire life as a farmer to pay for that, you're now potentially approaching retirement age. So at the time, I was raising beef cattle and hay, and really desiring to get into row crop farming for corn, soy, small grains, etc. And so it became a little bit of a chicken and egg challenge, right? In order to get some of the USDA loans and those types of programs needed a history. And so it became apparent that I needed to find another solution if I was going to make this happen quickly. Go ahead, next. So we set out to acquire land. Mary was able to take cash from her self-directed IRA and buy a farm. And we can dive into the story of how we failed at an auction and then found another parcel later that actually turned out to be a better piece of land. But the goal of this really was to provide access such that Wyatt had a path to ownership. As Mary mentioned, her goal was to preserve the wealth that she had built and ride inflation, and did not need the funds in the near term, but in the long term would need that for supporting her own retirement. So the timelines happened to align for she and I, but there's lots of ways. I don't want anyone to get hung up on the timelines. It doesn't mean that someone has to be in their early 30s and the other in their 50s, and we can dive into that, and I'm happy to answer questions about that. Also, we are not accountants, we are not attorneys, we are not providing legal advice. This is the disclaimer that is telling everyone on this that is our story. We're sharing our own personal experience. We are not giving you advice. So I want to give some credit to Dr. Danny Kleinfelter. He's an Illinois native who made his career at Texas A&M University. He was massively influential in my life and my early agriculture career, as he's been for many people. He founded a program called TPAP, the Executive Program for Agricultural Producers. And there have been hundreds of farmers and people in agribusiness who have gone through that program in the last 30 plus years. Sadly, Danny has since passed, but his legacy lives on in our situation as it does in many others. And the TPAP program does continue. So please take time to research him, the research that he performed, and the TPAP as a whole, because it's a wonderful organization. And what I liked about it the most, and continue to, is that it's agnostic to crops. When I went through that program, we had apple producers and dairies and people in the vegetable space and corn and soybean. And so the principles that he introduced and talks about are not about a corn farm or a soybean farm. It's about managing an agribusiness, managing relationships, managing people. And that's really important. And so Danny, probably in 2008, I guess it would have been, introduced me to this concept of the self-directed IRA being able to invest in things outside of stocks and bonds. As an aside, since Mary and I have completed this transaction, I've personally used IRA funds to invest in some non-agricultural property, and I've been very happy with that process. Happy to talk about this offline with others, but the point is there are some very concise IRS rules about what is allowed and not allowed. We may talk about that a little bit on this, but there's some great resources out there. At risk of making an advertisement, I originally created mine through Midland IRA. They've since changed names, but the company still exists. And there's lots of ways you can do this, but your traditional banks and financial advisors and you name the companies that have offices in every town across the United States are not going to talk about this, because they get fees from promoting mutual funds, from trading stocks, and they're really not able to monetize those individual investors, cash in the same way. So this is not something that's well advertised. Should I talk about some of the nuances or go on?
No, we can go on. The
Okay, thanks, Mary.
SDIRA is not just another type of IRA. It is an IRA. And technically, any of these four types can be self-directed. However, that depends on your particular custodian and whether they support the type of SDIRA you prefer. So I leverage two types of SDIRAs, the traditional and the Roth. The ROS, as you probably know, is just has that you've already paid the taxes on it. The traditional, you still have to pay taxes. If I were to do it all over again, I would rethink having two types of SDIRAs. But that has meant double the fees to my custodian every year. And it also means double the fees for every distribution. So that said, those fees were trivial compared with the fees my banker quoted me when I was considering the ethical fund solution. An SDIRA has the same tax benefits as any other IRA. However, to prevent a taxpayer from double dipping in IRS benefits, there are strict rules that we have to comply with. And this is the trickiest part of setting up and maintaining an SDIRA. The investor must fully understand the rules. In my case, I found it difficult to find legal and tax help from someone who was well versed in the prohibited transactions. I could not simply trust the banker, the attorney, or the tax advisor without doing my own research. The prohibited transactions are where SDIRAs are very different from regular IRAs, and financial experts can lead you astray when they don't normally have to consider the consequences of a transaction that is prohibited under IRS rules. So I can't stress this enough. An SDIRA is not business as usual. So what are the rules? First of all, the investment cannot benefit yourself, your children, your parents, or any other lineal relative, or any of their spouses. The investor must keep private assets completely separate from SDIRA assets. And so, for example, there can be no linking of bank accounts. So when I went to set up the bank account for the LLC, I went to set it up with the same bank where I have my own checking account for convenience. In hindsight, I do not recommend that. The first thing the bank wanted to do was link the new account for the LLC with my own account because that would give me certain benefits associated with the higher combined balance. I was in an agreeable mood and was just about to do what they were advising me would be in my best interest. But thankfully, I remembered just in time that no, that would be a prohibited transaction. And that was my first wake-up call that not everyone in the financial industry knows about SDIRAs and prohibited transactions. So that was when I first realized I had to be on my own toes. Billing from an attorney, this is just another example. Billing from an attorney or accountant must be in the name of the entity of the investment and not in your name. So my attorney sent me invoices in my name, and I had to call him and say, hey, please redo these and put them in the name of the LLC instead. He should have known better. There can be no supplementing of IRA funds with personal funds. So what is those are just examples. There are other rules, but these are the ones that have been critical for me. And what is the consequence of a prohibited transaction? So your IRA is deemed fully distributed to you that year to the extent of the investment. So that defeats the whole purpose of an IRA to begin with. So it increases your taxable income for the year, and this could put you in a higher tax bracket for all of your income. If you're younger than 59 and a half, there could be premature distribution penalties as well. Since the IRS may not catch the prohibited transaction for several years, additional penalties can accrue for underreporting your income. And if this is a traditional SDIRA, your tax burden could be substantial and could require liquidation of the investment if you don't have other funds on hand to cover the taxes. If there are disqualified persons involved in the investment, additional penalties will be imposed on them. The bottom line is know the rules, respect the rules, do not rely solely on financial advice from experts. And now that we got the scary part out of the way, we can talk about the fun stuff and how the SDIRA approach can work with farmland. So basically, the investor rolls their 401k or regular IRA into the SDIRA, and the funds are then used to buy farmland. So the investor must be old enough to have sufficient funds in their 401k to purchase a farm. But if the investor is ready to retire and will soon need to start using the funds themselves, this approach won't work because this is a long-term investment. Well, there is a sweet age at which the investor is neither too young nor too old to make this work. I was 59 at the time, and that turned out to be just right in my case. Once you roll your 401k into an SDIRA, you can start using the funds for your investment. You can invest directly in a farm, and to do that, you would make a request to your SDIRA custodian to write a check for the purchase on behalf of the SDIRA. The difficulty with that is a lot of land is sold at auction where the buyer needs to be prepared to cut a check right then and there. You also have property taxes to pay every year and possible other expenses, and it could be a huge hassle, not to mention fees, to have to ask the custodian to write those checks. I opted to create a limited liability company to ease the logistics of managing the investment. The LLC is there solely for the ability to write checks. I can be the manager of the LLC as long as I'm not paid for that role. I directed the custodian to purchase the LLC on behalf of my SDIRAs. The LLC has a bank account that held the funds until Wyatt found the right farm. And when he did, the LLC purchased the farm. The LLC owns the land, pays the property taxes, and is Wyatt's landlord. All of our legal agreements are between Wyatt and the LLC. So Wyatt and I worked hard on the partnership agreements, and we included features that were important to both of us. It was important that the farm be certified organic. Transitioning to organic can be very challenging for a farmer because he or she has to work harder and longer hours to conform to the organic stipulations. But there's a 3-year period of farming organically before the certification can be obtained, and during that time, the farmer cannot sell the crop at the higher organic prices. Because of my involvement with the Land Connection, I knew that their recommendation to landowners was to set a lower rent during those first 3 years to help ease the cash flow challenge. Every 5 years, Wyatt and I transition a certain percentage of the land ownership from the LLC to Wyatt. We have a schedule that includes dates and the percent of transfer that we adhere to. This provides some liquidity for me, and Wyatt gradually builds his interest in the land over time. It also helps me because I already have a committed buyer for the property. I won't have to advertise, I won't have to hire a realtor or deal with any of that stress. All of the negotiations are already behind us. It's a priority to both of us that this land will be transitioned to Wyatt. I am not looking to get rich off of this arrangement. I simply want to protect my savings from inflation until I need to start using them. As mentioned before, my crystal ball tells me that land appreciation alone will be sufficient to protect my savings against inflation. So although I do charge rent, a certain amount of that rent is applied to the purchase during those 5-year transitions. An interesting twist in this arrangement is that since Wyatt now owns a portion of the land, he essentially pays himself a portion of the rent. So over time, as his interest in the land increases, he will pay less and less rent to the LLC. And although I have a lot of trust in Wyatt, and I think he also has a lot of trust in me, it was important to both of us to put everything in writing. There was a lot of stake for both of us, and many opportunities for misunderstanding. This is also a very long-term partnership, and I didn't trust my own brain to be able to recall the details of our agreements. We also didn't want to leave any aspect out. For example, it would have been easy to put off drafting the purchase agreement until the time of the first 5-year transition. But what if transition time came and we couldn't agree on the price or the terms? 5 years would already be behind us with considerable investment of time and money from both of us. So we carefully hammered out all of the details as a single package up front. The 3 interlocking agreements cannot be taken independently. They are 3 parts of the same agreement. First, we have a 5-year lease agreement. That is the most typical of all of the 3 agreements we have. We referred to 3 or 4 sample lease agreements in drafting our own lease agreement. we had to include a base rent that was sufficient to cover real estate taxes each year. This is important because if the LLC didn't have funds to pay the taxes, I would not be in a position to supplement the funds myself. And that would be a prohibited transaction. Since the real estate taxes tend to go up each year, we built into the lease that the base rent would go up by the same amount. The base rent is not shared at all by Wyatt, even when he owns 1% of the land. The real estate tax obligation is also not shared by Wyatt. The LLC is solely responsible for the tax payments. We also have a variable rent that is based on farm revenue. I already described the transition agreement a little bit, and Wyatt will fill in more details with the next slide. We agonized over the details of how we would establish the purchase price and how we would deal with any default on payments or if one of us died. We do decide every 5 years whether we want to continue the partnership, and the transition agreement establishes the consequences of backing out. The purchase agreement is also fully drafted. All we have to do is fill in 2 blanks, one that specifies the percent of undivided interest that is being purchased by Wyatt, and the other is the purchase price itself. When we finally had everything hammered out, I turned our 3 draft documents over to an attorney familiar with both farmland transactions and self-directed IRAs to make sure everything was legal and worded correctly.
So the schedule on the screen is what we agreed to at onset. It's kind of hard to believe that not next year, but before the following crop, we will have completed 2 out of the 5 transitions. So if you notice, well, one note for everyone, just because our agreement includes a transition to ownership does not mean that anyone investing in an IRA has to commit to that as well. There are definitely situations that someone might wish to own an asset within a self-directed IRA, but may not wish to sell that to their farmer or their tenant. They may wish to, pass that on to someone else or keep that, or maybe sell it at the end. What we've done was unique to our agreement, and I really appreciate that. And I think anyone who wishes to have the land cared for in a specific way would appreciate that as well. But if you notice, in the beginning, the initial transactions are only 10% of purchase. That kind of balloons over time. That served Mary and I well because as a young person starting farming, I had less cash available to invest in land. As a person in her working years, Mary had less need for that cash in her IRA. As time goes on and Mary needs more cash to live on in retirement, and hopefully Wyatt is more established in his career and has the ability to spend more and invest more in the land, that percentage ownership increases over time. So today, Wyatt Muse owns 10% of the land on the field as an undivided interest with Gilder Farm LLC. After next year's crop, we will establish the value of the land and that next 10% ownership. One point of note, there needs to be an annual valuation of any asset that's owned within a self-directed IRA. Much in the way that you get monthly or quarterly statements on stocks and bonds, you need to have an annual assessment. We've agreed that the realtor who initially marketed this parcel of land, who also owns an appraisal business, would be the best person qualified to make that annual valuation. So each year we get a packet, a statement that includes valuation of this parcel of land and uses other transactions in the area to justify it. Same way you would get an appraisal on a home or any other piece of property. So as many may be aware, the price of farmland really skyrocketed in the last 5 to 7 years. So Mary's smiling and I'm also smiling because despite the value of the land being a lot more than it was at the time of purchase, I get to gain in 10% of that, and the crop revenue associated with this land has been able to support that purchase. And so this will vary in different regions of the country, and there's different factors that may play into that. But this is our schedule. So in the year 2041, Wyatt will end up owning 100% of that, and Mary will have all of that in cash to invest or live on however she may wish. And as a personal aside, back in 2014, 2041 seemed like a very, very far off date in the future. And here we are almost into 2025. It doesn't quite seem so far away. So let's take pause and see if there's any questions.
All right, please use the chat if you have any questions.
Chat, okay.
Or actually, if you just want to say it, why don't you go ahead and say it?
My question was, since it's such a long timeline, what do you use in the event that somebody passes away? Do you have some kind of insurance, or what do you use in that event?
Yeah, we do. So for myself, I have sufficient.
Wyatt, you're cutting out. Can you start over with your answer?
Can you hear me better?
Yes.
Yep.
So I carry sufficient life insurance so that the balance of the funds will be paid off. And the idea is that if I get hit by a bus this afternoon, Mary will be made whole. My heirs will receive this farmland, and believe that Mary has a written plan in place such that if she passes prior to the contract being complete, the contract remains into the future. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, I'll just add my thing. The custodian requires, well, it may not be required, but has the ability to establish a beneficiary of your investment. And so I struggled with this because the SDIRA is a fairly complex transaction, and it takes a little bit of work to understand how to use it. And I didn't want to put the burden of managing the SDIRA on my normal heirs, the beneficiaries. And so I put as my beneficiary as the Land Connection, because the Land Connection is an organization that I felt would benefit from it, number one, and also would have the ability to deal with the extra complexity of managing it. And so that was before the current executive director came on board the Land Connection. That was some time ago, but it's still there. It's not changed, and it won't be changed. And so as long as the Land Connection stays around, then they're my beneficiary, but they may not get anything. If we, hopefully the whole thing will go over to Wyatt. And so but that was our fail clause in there. That was a good question. Thank you. Any other questions? We're not finished yet. We're just pausing here.
I see some questions coming through. Nathan, would you mind moderating the questions?
Sure. There is a question that says, when there is a purchase or transfer of shares to Wyatt, how is that paid for? The portion of rent going towards purchase or savings or a combination? At that point, it's a distribution, which would be taxed if it's a traditional IRA, correct?
No,
not correct. It's a combination. So a combination of accumulated bonus rent as well as cash out of hand. So let me think, was it 2021? What was the first year of transfer, Mary?
It was March 2021.
Yeah, so in 2021, Wyatt wrote a check to Gelder Farm LLC to complete that 10% purchase. The cash from that check went into the LLC that's wholly owned by the IRA.
Yes, and so the reason it isn't considered a distribution is that he wrote the check that benefited the LLC, not Mary Gelder. And as long as I don't take a distribution on from the LLC, that does not hit my taxes. So my tax liability did not change at that point. I have taken two. You'll find out. I have taken two small distributions since then, and those are taxed. But But no, the distribution when we transfer the land only goes to the LLC, and then I manage the distributions from then on out.
There's another
And to be
question.
clear,
Okay.
and to be clear to that point, if Wyatt were to write a check to Mary Gelder regarding this land, that's a prohibited transaction and that is tax fraud.
Yeah,
There's another question. Can the owner of the LLC also operate the land?
No, that falls under the self-dealing rules. And so as I understand the rules, again, please check, but it cannot benefit one's own business or a lineal relative. You cannot invest in this and rent it to your son or daughter or parent. It has to be arm's length.
and just the persnickety detail here, the owner of the LLC is the SDIRA. And so obviously, since that's not a personal entity, they can't operate the land either. But I assume that you meant by that, can the manager or can the manager of the LLC also operate the land? And that answer is no, is Wyatt explained.
There's another question. Do you pay taxes on profit as the LLC on your personal income tax return, or are there different considerations for a self-directed IRA?
Not at all. It's just like all of the taxes happen when I take a distribution.
Okay, here's another question. Are there any required minimum distributions from a self-directed IRA if you are older than 75?
I think when we started doing this and when I started my research, as soon as you hit 70 and a half, that's when the IRS requires you to start taking distributions. However, I believe they've changed that in the last year or two, maybe. And I'm not up on that because I'm not 70 and a half yet. But yes, they will require a certain amount, and I'm not sure what that is at that point. Again, we had to be careful. We carefully planned this out so that when I needed to start taking the distributions, there would be enough liquidity in the cash of the LLC that I would be able to start taking those required distributions.
All right, so here's the last question. Oh, go ahead.
Well, something I'd like to just highlight in future is that if I'm going to make a number, if it's valued at $1,000, whether that's invested in a stock, bond, farmland, commercial property, or otherwise, the value of that based on the annual valuation is the number that's triggering any required minimum distributions. So if you think about the value of that is what the IRS cares about. Whatever is that's invested in is really irrelevant as long as you're not self-dealing or breaking the rules.
Okay, I have one more question, and we'll get to some other questions at the next Q&A because I want to make sure that Mary and Wyatt can kind of finish their presentation. We have time for Paul too. Here's a question from Suzanne. Thanks for covering the benefits of the self-directed IRA. This really is a great situation for the two of you. Knowing that a contract per deed is an option for the transfer of property, it seems to me that the value of doing a land transfer through a self-directed IRA seems to be for the owner of the self-directed IRA. Is that correct?
The value of doing a land transfer through an SDIRA seems to be for the owner. Knowing that a contract for deed is an option for the transfer of property, it seems to me.
I think I understand the nature of the question, so I'll answer that. And if Susan has a different, if it was a different question, please correct me. But yes, Mary has certainly benefited more than Wyatt has from the appreciation of this land in the last 9 or 10 years. But had we not performed this transaction, Wyatt would not be able to farm that land. I would not have had the benefit of the annual income and the benefits that come along with being a farmer on that land. So if you think about much of the land in the Midwest is rented. And so the value that I see as a tenant on this is that not only am I renting a parcel of land, but I'm also having a path to ownership. And I think it's really common that a lot of land is owned generationally, and the tenant farmer may never have the opportunity to farm it. So I think that may cut both ways. And if that's not the nature of the question, please correct and we'll readdress.
I want to jump in with one. I want to jump in with one last question that I think is a real practical one from Mike. How much are the custodian fees, the appraisal fees? How are they covered?
Talk about yours, Mary, and then I'll talk about mine since I have another property.
So the custodian fees for me are approximately $400 per SDIRA. So since I have two, it's about $800 per year. Every January I pay that. And then what were the other fees? The appraisal fees.
Appraisal.
Well, that's an expense of the LLC. So the appraisal fee is usually, boy, I can't even remember. I write those checks. I don't have a head for financial things, and so I just write the check and go.
Yeah.
Every 5 years we have to go through a full appraisal. They estimate based on the transactions that have been in the area. So they estimate the land value on the other years, but every 5 years they have to go through a whole process, and that's usually quite a substantially more than the other off years for that. We're talking about a few hundred, not a huge amount.
Yeah. So for my
go ahead.
So for mine, it costs $5 to issue a check. So Midland or Equistar now charges me $5 in this self-directed IRA. That does things like paying the property taxes or paying for any potential building repairs. The annual valuation does not have to be a full appraisal, as Mary outlined. The reason that Mary and I use an appraisal is that we have agreed to a financial transaction and a change in percentage ownership. And so going into that, Mary and I agreed that a full appraisal felt appropriate to make sure that we had a thorough valuation. Things like a broker's letter of opinion and even property tax records are ones that will qualify for your annual valuation. So that's really a minimal cost in the scope of things, less than paying for mutual fund fees.
Yeah, well, that is a requirement from the custodian. So to do it every 5 years, they won't accept an appraisal for the partial appraisal for the other years.
Okay.
Every 5 years.
I'm delighted that there are so many questions. This is awesome. We're running just a little bit behind schedule. So Mike, I'm going to try to get back to your question at the next Q&A segment. But if Mary and Wyatt, you could continue, I think that'd be great.
Yeah, so we'll talk about the search for land. As mentioned, Mary and I began talking about this in 2014. It's quite exciting. If anyone's ever gone to an auction, there's quite an energy and a buzz in the room. And in today's world of online auctions, I think we're sadly losing a little bit of that excitement. But in January 2015, we identified a parcel of land that was suitable. It was in Champaign County, near my home farm, and we went to that auction. We bid it up to the maximum that we had agreed to going into it. That was the funds that were available to purchase. And we both walked out maybe a little bit deflated, but not devastated. And that we thought we were going to buy that piece of land, plant a crop on it that spring and get the process started. Did not work that way. That spring, I was helping my father plant, and my brother told me about a sign he saw on the side of the road, and a farm was for sale. Happened to be a little bit closer. It was a very good parcel of land. That would have been Memorial Day weekend, 2015. So we talked to the seller. That happened to be Heartland Ag Group in Decatur, Illinois, and the farm was already under contract for that year and had actually already been planted for that season. But we closed the LLC closed on purchasing that farm in the summer of 2015 and was able to begin cropping as Wyatt with the tenant in spring 2016. So this was a picture from the closing day. It's kind of amazing to imagine. And Griffin is now 5'2". Kind of a testament to how quick time goes by and flies by. But in the summer of 2015, we closed on that parcel, and it was a pretty exciting day. Talk to you a little bit about some pros and cons from the farmer. That is one way that we can build equity in land ownership without having that significant down payment that's required from traditional banks or the farm credit system. Having that security and being able to farm a parcel for the long term is also exciting. Many farmers in the past had the chance to count on being on a parcel of land for their whole life. Today, that seems to be more and more rare. Many farms are on an annual or maybe a 3-year lease. And I think putting my personal situation aside, that fast turnover of leases is a detriment to the preservation and quality of land and care for the environment, because tenants are incentivized to maximize the revenue off that land in a given year rather than taking the long view. Going into this, I had the security of knowing that I had at least 25 years of commitment where I can build that soil and grow crops on it that are going to benefit it for the long term. Some of the cons, I think, for the farmer is, timelines, implementation, age, stage of career. There's a number of things that can be a challenge. It's not as easy as talking to a local farm manager and saying, yeah, I'll sign a 1-year lease. I mean, this is a big commitment. It's a long commitment. We can go to the next.
So I've been so happy with this arrangement. It was actually fun to research the ins and outs of the SDIRA and figure out how to work things out with Wyatt. That was surprising to me, considering how little interest I have in financial matters. It's also surprising how much more tolerant I am of the special risks of this investment. It's pretty amazing how your attitude and behavior can change when you're passionately involved in what you're doing. I believe my savings are safe. I don't freak out every time the markets take a nosedive. This is a low-stress investment. The transition schedule keeps the bulk of my funds in the land. Wyatt only purchases a small percentage during the first decade, and this is great because I don't need the funds early on. But liquidity increases over time just when I anticipate needing the funds. I have a committed, ready buyer, so I don't have to worry about that. The funds are invested in something that I'm personally passionate about. I feel a certain amount of satisfaction that I had a small part in transitioning those acres to organic. The first transition was a thrill. It was the first culmination of our mutual goal to transition the land to the person who actually works the land, the farmer. That's who the land should belong to, and I like to think that Great-Grandpa Gelder would approve of this arrangement. My annual fees to the custodian are minimal compared to the fees that I would have paid the banker to manage my IRA ethical funds. The biggest con is that I have to do everything myself. I have to be the one maintaining the LLC with the Secretary of State and writing reports to the custodian and sending rent invoices and receipts to Wyatt. I can't just sit back and check the statements on my retirement funds that are generated by some bank's computer somewhere. And with that, I have to be knowledgeable about the prohibited transactions and always be on my guard. Since this is not a solution that is widely adopted by investors, it is difficult to find experienced or knowledgeable professional help. My investment is not as liquid as a 401k or a regular IRA. When I do need a distribution, it takes a lot of time from the initial request to the receipt of the money, and we're talking weeks. Another is I have all my eggs in one basket. I think my basket is pretty secure with Wyatt though. And finally, I learned after the fact that I need another way to invest the incoming funds that are no longer tied up in the land until I want to take a distribution. So I haven't done a very good job of that. If any of you can think of additional pros and cons for either the farmer or the investor, can you please type those into the chat? And since we're a little short, we're running short on our schedule, we're just going to have you put them in the chat and we'll move on. Everyone can read them from the chat. So the most important benefit of this partnership, and Wyatt alluded to this earlier, is that I have a real relationship with Wyatt, not like the pretend relationship my banker wanted with me. Wyatt sends me pictures of the farm every once in a while. I especially enjoy hearing about his kids chasing the butterflies on the farm. They're growing up with a healthy attitude towards land and land stewardship. I can even visit the farm myself if I'd like, although it is a few hours south of where I live. Wyatt gave me a big rock from the farm. It's a glacial erratic. I have that in a prominent place in my home landscape, and it is a daily reminder that my investment is tangible. I feel good whenever I see that rock. And it was downright fun to collaborate with Wyatt to achieve something that is important to both of us. So each year I'm required by my SDIRA custodian, as we mentioned before, to report on the value of the investment. And for that, I have to have the land appraised. This chart shows how the land appraised value has changed each year. For the first few years, the value went very slightly downhill before it increased. And our first transition was early in 2021. And we used the 2020 end of year appraised value to establish the purchase price of Wyatt's 10% interest. That's the green bar there on the chart. So it was right before the land increased substantially. But as the land continues to increase in value, Wyatt's own investment will also increase along with mine.
Yeah, so I think a couple lessons learned in this is, talk about the idea. I think one thing that we've not touched on that I want to just mention briefly is that there is an opportunity for multiple people to pool SDIRA assets to invest in the same LLC. So a situation could exist that 3, 4, 25, if you can all come to agreement, people get together and co-invest into one parcel. I think having some patience, when you're excited about something, it's hard to be patient. If I think about that auction and, I was so gung-ho that day and it actually worked out. This is a better parcel of land. Do your diligence, read, consult tax professionals, and give yourself plenty of time. Don't think if there's an auction next week, you can pull this off in the short term. We can go ahead.
I want to make sure that you mentioned that the person who chooses the land shouldn't be the SDIRA owner. It should be the farmer. I mean, I don't know anything about land quality. I relied on Wyatt, and that was the best decision I made because Wyatt knows the farmland. He knows what would be convenient for him, and I just left it in his lap, and he ran with it. So just trust the farmer. Let the farmer make that choice.
Yep, and I'll add to that and make a kind of a story that I've seen play out many times. Maybe someone's father or uncle or grandfather or grandmother are farmers, and maybe they've been on a parcel of land for some years that is rented land, and that land comes for sale, but they may not have a desire to purchase it. It's one way for someone to be able to acquire land and avoiding prohibited transactions, not let that slip away and go to someone else. So we want to, think about it outside of just a one-off like Mary and I, and think about it in a broader scale and being able to preserve a parcel of land. So yeah, we began the transition process. I'll stay out of the technical details of that for this webinar, but we utilized alfalfa hay to make the transition and harvested our first certified organic crop in 2018. So kind of impressive to imagine how quick that time's gone by for me. Any additional questions? I saw a few come through.
Yeah, actually, Mike, could you jump on? You had some questions about a self-directed 401k, and you had some questions about where the funds are coming from for the appraisal and for rent. Mike, can you just jump on real quick?
Yeah, well, it's back to that earlier question. So between the appraisals and even those small fees, where it wasn't clear to me, since you don't have that in the base rent, where that money is coming from.
The appraisals are paid by the rent that Wyatt is paying, and we did include enough in the original base rent amount to cover not only the property taxes, but also the appraisal. So the LLC pays for the appraisal, that Wyatt has nothing to do with that.
And actually, could you just speak to what is that variable rent? How is that determined, and how much are we talking about here?
Wyatt, do you want to?
Yeah, so we set a base rent. Yeah, I don't want to misquote dollar amounts, but really the base rent is only set to cover the annual cost that Mary incurs for paying property tax. I'm sorry, the LLC incurs for paying property taxes, fees, etc. Are we 35% of gross revenue? Is that the number, Mary? I don't want to misquote that. I'm sorry. But the point is, each year, Wyatt as the tenant pays a fixed percentage of the gross revenue from growing that crop. I think that varies by region, by crop type, so I don't want to tell anyone what's appropriate there. In Illinois, certified organic corn is the money crop. We get by with small grains, we get by and build the soil, but don't make a lot of money in those other years. But I don't know, what was it, Mary? 2 years ago, the rent was like $840 per acre or something. I mean, it was significant, significantly higher than what we would pay otherwise. So I don't know if that answers the question. If it doesn't, I'm happy to go on.
Yeah, I just, but that was 2 years ago when corn prices were higher, or is that still?
Yeah.
Is that still?
Yeah, that was when corn.
800 pretty typical for what
That's
you're
when that's extremely high. So side note, anyone can look this up, but USDA just released the cash rent by county, and Wyatt County, Illinois was the top cash rent in the nation. As a tenant farmer, that doesn't feel very good. As a landowner, it feels excellent. So I will say that, I think 377 was the average for 2024. And I probably have this. I know we have it on a spreadsheet somewhere, but it would be curious to see how that plays out over time. The point is that the higher crop revenue also accompanied the higher land price. And this is not development land. This isn't on the edge of Chicago or a place where anyone's going to build houses. It is it's 20 miles from Champaign. It's not development. And so the point is that the underlying crop revenue is what supports the value of that land. And so in absence of some kind of crazy decoupling, we believe that in times of high crop revenue, we see high land prices, and in a downturn of low crop revenue, we should also expect a potential decrease in the value of the land. And that's just part of the wave of agriculture and growing crops for anyone.
All right. Thank you for that. I want to move next to Paul to give him a chance to kind of share his financial analysis of the arrangement. And then we will, if we have time, we'll have some more questions at the very end. So Paul, why don't you take it away?
Okay, thanks, Nathan. Thanks, Mary, Wyatt. So I'm Paul Dietmann. I'm with Compeer Financial, which is part of the Farm Credit System. I'm based in Wisconsin, and I lead a loan program for farmers who market products directly to consumers or do something in value-added agriculture. I heard Mary and Wyatt tell their story at the Illinois Organic Grain Conference earlier this year, and it was really inspired by what they had to say. Being a numbers guy, I'm always thinking in terms of what's the return on investment. And I was impressed just doing a back of the envelope calculation that even though Mary's living out her values and putting her retirement funds to work, living her values and helping Wyatt achieve his goals too, there actually was a decent rate of return on this investment. And so, so we're going to go through that a little bit here today. Next slide, please, Mary. So when we talk about investment, it forces us to think about how the value of money changes over time. And I think most of us know money has a time value. The sooner that you get a payment, the better off you are. You could use that money to stop interest from accruing. you take away the risk of inflation causing you to lose buying power, or that you may not get those dollars in the future. When we invest, we expect the benefit of an investment to be in the future. And we have to adjust what that future payment is worth in today's dollars, because we have to wait to get the payment. Longer we have to wait, the bigger the payment should be. The longer we wait, the greater the risk is that you're not going to get paid back at all. Next slide, please. So I think we all are familiar with the concept of compounding. So if you took $10,000, you put it today into a 3-year certificate of deposit, and it's going to yield 5%, we could calculate out what that money is going to be worth 3 years from now, right? We're going to get 5% this year. We're going to get 5% next year on our initial investment, but also on our first year's interest, and it compounds over time. So if we're compounding at 5%, that $10,000 that we invest today, 3 years from now is going to be worth $11,618. So we would have compounded $1,618 over that period of time. Next slide, please. So we're used to going forward with that calculation, but we can also go backwards with that calculation. So let's say we can make an investment today. We know we're going to get a payment 3 years from now that's $10,000, and we want to get a 5% return on our money. We can discount that $10,000 payment 3 years from now to today's dollars to figure out how much do we have to put in today in order to get a 5% return on our investment. That's called discounting. Well, when we discount at a 5% discount rate, the discount is $1,362. So that means if we want a 5% return on our money, we know we're going to get $10,000 3 years from now, we'd have to put $8,638 into that investment. So there's 3 factors here. It's what we're going to put in up front, it's what the discount rate is, and what that investment is going to be worth in the future. Those are the 3 things that we have to keep in mind. Next slide, please. So why is discounting important when we're thinking about farm investments? Well, when we make a farm investment, the rate of return isn't known and guaranteed ahead of time like it would be if you're investing in a CD. You know, the rates on a CD are posted someplace, and we know that when we invest, we're going to get that rate of return. We typically know how much cash we have available to invest in something. And like in Mary's case, she knew how much money she had put into her self-directed IRA. That's what was available to purchase land, right? So we know how much cash is available to invest. We could probably estimate how that investment is going to impact the annual farm cash flow, whether it's positive or negative, in the years ahead. So if we can put together a rough cash flow projection, we've got the second element of what we need. And then we have to decide what rate of return we want on our investments. So if we know those first 2 things, we know how much cash we're going to invest, we know what the cash flow is going to be, we can figure out what that discount rate is, what the annual rate of return is. Just like we could if we knew how much cash we had to invest and we knew what the compound rate is. We can figure out what that payment is going to be worth 3 years from now. So we can figure this any of the 3 directions, right? So we have to decide what rate of return we want on our investments. Next slide, please. So how do we choose that discount rate? Well, we could use the interest rate we'd have to pay to get a loan for the investment. So right now, if you're going to buy land, our 30-year fixed rate on a land loan is going to be in the mid 7% range. So you probably want to get at least 7.5%. You could use the prime lending rate and add to it the rate of inflation. You could establish a personal hurdle rate. You heard Mary say a couple of times, she wanted her investment to beat the rate of inflation. She didn't want to lose her nest egg. She wanted to at least keep up with inflation. Whichever method we use, we need to adjust for the riskiness of the investment. So if we're not quite sure that the cash flow is going to work out, we're going to increase our discount rate to adjust for that risk. In this situation, Mary was able to adjust her discount rate down because she isn't worried about Wyatt not following through on his commitment. And they've got pretty clear and well laid out agreements between the 2 of them, as they mentioned. So next slide, please, Mary. So this idea of taking a future payment and discounting it to today's dollars, that's called net present value. It's known as net present value. It tells us what a future payment is worth in today's dollars at a given discount rate. So we can do it like that example that I showed where you had $10,000 3 years from now at a 5% discount rate, what you had to pay today or what it was worth in today's dollars. You can also convert a whole stream of cash flow. So you could run a cash flow projection and discount year one cash flow and year two cash flow and year three cash flow and come up and take all those numbers, add them together and come up with a single dollar amount that you would need to pay this year in order to get that discount rate. It's going to tell us if the investment opportunity is likely to meet our target return. It's not going to necessarily tell us it's the best investment we could make. To do that, we have to take it one step farther, and that's internal rate of return. Next slide, please, Mary. Internal rate of return is a method of just trying a series of discount rates until we find the one that gives us a net present value that's equal to our initial investment. So we look at that entire cash flow and we keep applying different discount rates to it until we get to the one where the net present value of that cash flow is equal to the investment that we made. Back in the old days when I learned how to do this, we had to calculate this using tables. Now I can plug it into an app on my phone. By calculating that internal rate of return and finding the net present value or finding the discount rate that gives us the net present value that's really close to what we what our initial investment was, it gives us the annual rate of return on the initial cash investment. And then by doing that, we can compare investments that have different dollar amounts required to make the initial investment, that have different lifespans, that have different residual values at the end of the investment term, and all sorts of things. Next slide, please. So again, we could calculate the internal rate of return on any investment if we know the initial cash investment required, if we can estimate what the annual cash flow is going to be while we've got the investment in place, and then what the remaining value of the investment is at a given point in its lifespan. Next slide. So let's run the SDIRA investment scenario and see what the internal rate of return was on that. Well, we know that Mary had, or at least her SDIRA had, approximately $470,000 to invest in a piece of land. The SDIRA investment required approximately $800 per year in fees. Mary mentioned those fees that have to be paid every year because she had there's essentially two SDIRAs together. It's double the fees. So it would have been $400 a year roughly if it was just all in one instead of two. Mary took two distributions. She took a distribution in 2021 that was $28,169. She took the exact same distribution again in 2023, but she's taken no other withdrawals since 2015. Only those two distributions that she took since 2015 when they purchased the land. The value of the SDIRA at the end of 2023 was $692,947. About 95% of that was the value of the land. The rest was in the checking account, the LLC's checking account. Of that $692,947, $19,734 of that is Wyatt's portion. He mentioned he's paid in already. He's bought into the LLC now, and so we have to subtract that to get to what Mary's part of this is. Next slide, please, Mary. And here's the way it looks. So you see in year zero, that's 2015. They put in the LLC purchased the land and also put money into checking, and that was $460. I'm having a hard time reading those numbers. They're pretty small. $468,960, I believe, is the number there. There were in year 2016, there were no fees paid. And then you see in the column under expenses, it says other costs. $790 a year is what was paid in SDIRA custodian fees for the first 4 years, and then 3 years the fees went up to $850. If we go a little bit further to the right, the annual cash flow to Mary, she took a distribution in 2021 that was $28,169. She took another distribution last year, 2023, that was $28,169. And then the residual value, $673,213, is her portion of what's remaining in the LLC at this point. So her internal rate of return, and this is annualized rate of return, is 5.59%. So not a bad rate of return. During that time, from 2015 to 2023, the average rate of inflation was 2.86%. You know, we think about inflation in the last couple of years has been pretty high, but in the early years, like 2015, the rate of inflation that year was 0.1%. 2016, it was 1.0%. So we had some years that inflation was very low. The average rate of inflation over that period of time that the investments have been in place is 2.86. The annual change in the price of the S&P 500 during that period of time was 8.73%. And that's the S&P 500. That's not excluding, investments like Monsanto Bayer. So a return really, it doubled the rate of inflation. So she achieved her goal of at least beating inflation, but it was a little bit lagging of the S&P 500. But, she talked pretty eloquently about the other benefits here. They're not all financial benefits. There's other benefits to this investment that are less tangible, but still very real. Next slide, please, Mary. So if we didn't think about the time value of money, the fact that this investment has been in place for a number of years, it wasn't like the money went in, that 468,960 was invested today and tomorrow you got all the cash flow back out of it. It took a period of time. The change in the value of the SDIRA over that period of time from 2015 to 2023, it increased by 204,253. The income, this was the distributions that Mary took less all the expenses that were incurred, was a net of 49,693. So if we didn't figure the time value of money, and I'm saying this is wrong, we don't do it this way, but if we did it this way, the return would have been 253,946 divided by the initial investment of 468,960 is a 54% return on the investment. That's not taking into account the time value of money. That's why it's so important that we run this out and figure internal rate of return. So that's what I've got for my portion of it. I know I went through that pretty quickly. I've got some other presentations on this subject and articles I've written. I'm happy to share with you. But I just want to give you that sense of how this investment has worked out so far.
Thanks a lot, Paul.
One quick comment, Paul. Thank you.
Yes, go ahead.
Thank you very much, Paul. And one quick comment regarding that. When we look at the return on the S&P, that does not consider fees that would be paid to a fund manager to invest in that. So typically, realized return from investment in the stock market is less than the performance of the S&P because of the fees to manage it. And we were considering the fees to manage the SDIRA.
Yeah, and it's typical that they take 1% of assets, if it's actively managed.
Yeah.
That's a good point.
All right, we have a few minutes. I'm going to throw it open to any questions for Paul or Mary or Wyatt. We did have a question some time ago about could multiple SDIRAs invest in pooled land ownership via something like an REIT, or a REIT, a real estate investment trust?
I'm not going to. Yeah, I'm not going to speak to the IRS rules around a REIT, but as I mentioned earlier, multiple SDIRAs can own percentages in an LLC. Do your own research on a REIT. There's some dividend requirements that I'm kind of familiar with there, but in the example of, I'll make up 3 people. One person has 60% ownership and the other 2 have 40%, or the percentages don't really matter as long as the dollars committed are commensurate with the value of the LLC shares. So there is an opportunity maybe for some liquidity and some creative ways of pooling funds. And if you just said there's 100 shares in the LLC, you could trade those out accordingly. So I don't know if that answers the question, but happy to talk through that. And I do know of some examples where multiple people in a community that are non-farmers came together and pooled funds in a way that they could buy a parcel of land and then rent it to a single farmer.
We also had a question from Melanie. Do you want to share your question? It was about refinancing. I think it might be easier if you explained your question.
Sure. So I know one of the obstacles to getting farmland that was mentioned is kind of not having enough even kind of history either in farming or perhaps credit history for the banks to take you seriously. Obviously, interest rates flex over time. So I'm wondering if there's an opportunity that would be beneficial to both folks to cash out at some point. So after you've been paying down on the land as the farmer for a set amount of time, kind of showing that history, if there was a kind of a better deal available from USDA, SBA, take your choice, or a loan would work better. Is there a chance to refinance and pay out kind of all at one time to the LLC? In which case, I guess the LLC could like help another farmer purchase land. But I didn't know if, given the very unique structure, if there's other considerations going on there, or if that would need to be in like a very upfront agreement.
I think that gets to the core of it. Yes, that opportunity exists. Given Mary and I's agreement, that's not what we're looking to do. I guess to surface something a little personal, there is no mortgage on this land. I don't have a mortgage on my share of ownership, nor does the LLC. My share of ownership does go on my balance sheet that I provide to Farm Credit each year. I don't value it at the inflated value that we've had in recent years. I actually value it at the purchase price that we made, so as not to overinflate that. But the opportunity does exist for the individual, not the IRA, to get a mortgage on it. You can get a mortgage against property in a self-directed IRA, but it has to be a non-recourse loan. So I think if you look at your typical LTV ratios that are required by banks, it's going to be quite a bit larger if you look at, a smaller LTV if you're going to apply leverage to a self-directed IRA purchase, if that makes sense.
Yeah, if I could add to that too, Wyatt, it's really, really difficult to finance property in a self-directed IRA because of that non-recourse issue. The bank basically can't come back against the land. And also, a bank wouldn't be able to require anyone to individually co-sign that loan, because then that violates those self-dealing rules. So you'll have a really hard time finding a lender that would be interested in lending on a piece of property that's in a self-directed IRA. And if you do find them, it's going to be at exorbitant rates.
Right.
I have another question I think is worth sharing. Does Wyatt have any concerns about land values increasing faster than farm income in his future purchases, especially his final buyout?
Sure, that's a risk. I mean, we have to throw some faith at this, and that's a risk that I think a lot of people face, and that's possible, but the risk I've been willing to accept.
So I want to say something on that too, because I probably worry about that more than Wyatt does. maybe I do. But I am not trying to get rich off of Wyatt. I think that his value as the farmer, and he's working the land, and we have to be careful about what we're doing in the future. The big question mark when we were doing this was what's going to happen to that land. Like I had my crystal ball, but did I know that it was going to go up? We don't know that it might take a nosedive in some cases. Maybe things will change with the farmland in central Illinois, maybe with climate change or something, where all of the farmland is burned up and we don't have it. Anything could happen in that length of time. But I do worry about it, and I do want to be fair to Wyatt on that. And so if it comes to the point where we have to reevaluate that in the purchase price of that land, I'm going to definitely bring that up.
All right, so we are at 1:29. I'm hoping that Mary and Wyatt and Paul might be willing to stay on a little bit after we officially close. Mary, can we go to the next slide? So I want to offer this. The next slide has contact information for all of us. And if you have particular questions about things that were shared, I know that Mary and Wyatt and Paul would be happy to answer your questions. And I appreciate that. So you can contact them that way. We do have one poll question. Jeannie, are you able to run that real quickly? We would love to just hear about what you thought, whether this was helpful to you. Jeannie, can you do that? There we go. So after attending the webinar, how well do you feel you understand self-directed IRAs and how they can be used to protect farmland that can be made available to a farmer to purchase farmland? So if you could quickly take that, and then we're going to go to our final slide. While we're seeing the results, I want to give a big shout out again to Mary and Wyatt and Paul for taking time today, for sharing their information, for sharing their ideas. I especially want to give a shout out to Mary and Wyatt, who did a lot of work for this presentation and who have been so patient with me whenever I asked for you guys to share your story. So thank you so much for that. All right, we'll end the poll. There is a QR code that will take you to a regular feedback survey. We'll also be emailing that to you. We'd really appreciate your help in helping us get better with that. And we will be sending you an email too with the PDF of the PowerPoint that I think you'll appreciate that information, and a supplemental piece of information as well. With that, we're going to end it officially. So glad that you joined us. Hope you have a great week. Thanks for all the work you do. I'm sorry we couldn't get all of your questions during this sort of the standard time. So that's it.